All right, let's take a moment and talk about the polls, because I know a bunch of you are worried about the polls, especially since now mainstream media is now cranking up the machine. That like Bernie is plummeting in the polls, he's sliding. It's all downhill for Bernie Sanders now that Joe Biden is in the race. Okay, like they're really cranking up that machine right now, and uh, you know it's hard not to pay attention, which is one reason why I actually don't pay attention to mainstream media. Um, but okay, so in this video, I just want to kind of go through a few things to help gain some perspective and some things that we should look at. But also, here's something that we should be focusing on instead of the polls until the debates start, okay? Which we have about like 6 weeks now. It's like towards the end of June when the first debates start, which is exciting, right? Because like I can't wait to see Bernie on the stage against everybody else. Because really, it's gonna be, the debates are really gonna be Bernie and everyone else. Let's be honest, right? Because his policies and platforms and all the things he's been announcing lately, like he is elevating the conversation and like forcing discussions to be had that probably would never have been had before. Okay, so all right, so here's a few things, and again, and one thing, a big thing that we should focus on instead of the polls right now. So okay, first thing, a lot of these polls, first of all, they're put on by like establishment type institutions, okay? Typically universities and mainstream medium outlets themselves, right? So we have these universities like Quinnipiac, Emerson, Harvard. I mean, so remember, these universities have huge endowments, right? Where they get gifts, donations from who? Very wealthy people, right? Whose children goes to those organizations or their alumni, right? So they have influence there. And then there's mainstream media, right? So CNN has its poll, Fox, The Hill, like, so remember, I mean, CNN is very biased against Bernie Sanders. Like, I don't know if we would say they're the most, but they're one of the tops. And we all know this, right? So they're going to manipulate information so that it looks better for certain candidates that they like, right? So again, remember that the people putting on these polls are actually extensions of the establishment who have a vested interest in not having a Bernie Sanders president, okay? And then you look at the sample size, and a lot of these polls, the sample sizes are like under 500. Like, these are like, we have polls polling the whole nation. Like, you have less than 500 people, like 500 Democrats that you're polling, or even within a state. Like, anything under 500 is just really small. I mean, it's tiny. And so in some of the polls, now when we get to demographics, the polling for people like under 30 or under 40 is so small that they don't even include them in the poll because the sample size is so small. But when you're starting with a small sample size in the first place, right, it's easy to just kind of, whack off like the small size, which is the younger people, which we know that Bernie Sanders does really well with, right? I mean, he won more votes than Hillary and Trump put together in 2016, okay? So these polls that say, where Biden is beating Bernie in the youth vote, like, it's just like unbelievable. Like, how is that possible? Because we can also see, in the rallies, like the enthusiasm, the crowds that show up. So that's, another thing to kind of consider, that perhaps, are the polls reflecting, what we're seeing in the rallies? Like, is there a disconnect there? Because we're kind of seeing, like today, Joe did his big launch in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. Yeah, he's in Pennsylvania. And about 1,000 people showed up. 1,000. Okay, Bernie did his in New York on a cold winter day, and over 13,000 people showed up. Okay, he's like, he's in the South right now, and his rally in Asheville had like 2,300 people, which is more than Biden has, right? So like, in a case like, believe your eyes, believe what we're seeing, the momentum that we're seeing at the rallies, right? But also, like, is there a reflection of that in the polls? Okay, so between like these big establishment, institution doing the polls, and then these small sample sizes, okay, so there's a lot of room for manipulation. So a lot of the people, these polls, they could be polling a higher percentage of older voters who typically will go with Joe Biden, right? And a lot of that is based on nostalgia, right? The good feelings that people have had, remembering the good old days of the Obama administration, right? Because when you compare it to now, it does feel good. But if we honestly take a look back, there's a lot of things that won't work now. And so we're starting to see that. But, something very important to realize too is that, again, a lot of the poll boost right now is based on Obama nostalgia, right? Those feel-good feelings. Because Joe Biden hasn't talked about any platform yet. How can he be a front runner when he hasn't released a full platform? Like, so you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing like feel-good things to like Bernie, who actually has policies and platforms out there now, right? Or even the other candidates running, right? So, I mean, we can't even compare Joe yet because he hasn't said what he stands for. Now, he has started to talk about things that he's for or against. Like a big one, he's against Medicare for all. Like that's a big doozy one. Like that issue could be a make or break in some states for a lot of voters, right? And when we get to the older voters, he's already said multiple times that he's for cutting Social Security. Okay, how do you think that's going to do well with the older voters? Or like, the soon-to-be older voters, right? Like the ones in our 40s and 50s are like, well, wait a minute. Like, okay, those cuts may not take an effect to, affect those in their 70s and 80s, but like those of us in our 40s and 50s, like that's gonna affect us, right? Or even the 60s. Like, so like those are some big issues that people don't realize. So until there's platforms to be compared, like these polls are just really off because people don't know. So that's why by the time we get to the debates, right, Biden needs to have a platform by the debates, because then that's, it'll be full on, like the candidates will be pitching like their vision and their platform. So in the meantime, instead of worrying about the polls, which again could change and it's very early, we need to focus on the ground game. The ground game is where we grow momentum and educate voters, clarify things, and even educate them on how the polls work. Because a lot of them, they just assume like, oh, this is what I heard on TV. But if you explain to them like how it actually works, then they start like, oh, I didn't realize that, right? Like, look at the sample size, look at the age groups, right? That they like get them to look at this. So part of our ground game is not just educating like about Bernie Sanders, but how like the polling system works. And then, telling people too, like, hey, just wait till the debates. Like, let's see what happens when, Bernie and Biden are like next to each other and now they're, comparing platforms. Because here's the thing, Biden has never actually been compared to an actual progressive before. So think about that, right? Or, if we're going on the Obama nostalgia, like in the last election, like 2012, if we go back to then, there really wasn't like that many, like progressive candidates or issues. Like they weren't talking about Medicare for all. They weren't talking about raising the minimum to 15. I mean, remember when Hillary came in, she wanted to raise it to 12. Like she thought that was doable. And we're like, no, we want 15. Right? And it was only because of Bernie Sanders, who came in with his bold self and said, all these things like Medicare for all and $15 minimum wage and free college and like all this stuff now has become a big conversation, and he's moved the narrative in a totally different direction. So now Biden will be compared to that. So let's see what happens, okay? So in the meantime, until the debates, don't worry about the polls. focus on the ground game, focus on educating people about the polls and telling them the same thing. Let's just wait till the debates, and let's wait till things get closer, because again, polls can change, but ground game is everything. That's where we win, is on the ground.